Hello everyone and welcome to this first ecoPortal webinar of 2018. My name is Manuel Seidel and I'm absolutely delighted to be your host for today's webinar. We've got a really exciting presentation lined up for you. Obviously, as you all know, ISO 45001 is set to be published in a couple of months' time. And the objective of this webinar is to give you an overview of some of the key changes that the ISO 45001 standard introduces. So I can see already that we've had some fantastic engagement via the chat function on the Crowdcast. You might also notice that there's an ask your question function to the left of that chat, and feel free to ask any questions that you might have throughout the presentation. We'll try and answer them as we go along, but we'll also have a dedicated slot at the end for question and answers. So a bit of an outline to our presentation before we crack into things. We're going to start with an overview of the journey to ISO 45001. Obviously, it's been a long time coming and there have been lots of people watching and waiting eagerly, and so we're going to talk you through a couple of key milestones there. Now, the core of the presentation is an overview of the key elements of the ISO 45001 standard. What are some of the changes that you can expect between 45001, OHSAS 18001, and 4801? And then we're going to jump into a discussion around the best approach to get started and what and how you should try and go about that. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll have a session at the end for question and answers. So do feel free to have those questions coming through. Now, I want to welcome our special guest, Chris Ward, who is joining us from the UK. Chris, it's 12 a.m. midnight your time, so thank you so much for joining us.
Manuel, thank you. It's good to be here. I mean, it is late at night here, but I'd rather be here in my own bed than having a bit of jet lag to get over to see you. But that's the modern world. We can speak to each other at all times of the day. Just as a quick word of introduction, Manuel, as you know, I used to work for the Health and Safety Executive over here in the UK. And I've been on the OHSAS 18001 BSI committee now for about 10 years. But my journey with safety management systems started 26 years ago when HSG 65 was first published in the UK, and that became popular around the world. It led to 18001 eventually, and now 45001 has been built on the back of that. So it's been quite a journey. And during that time, I both inspected and regulated for the HSE, and in the more recent years, been a consultant for safety management systems, and have spent 4 years working on a project to develop 45001 guidance, and you'll see more of that on the website link that you've put at the end of the presentation. I think that about sums it up, Manuel.
Yeah, really appreciate that introduction there, Chris. We've had a couple of chat messages coming through that the audio is not working. If that does happen, please let us know and we'll try and sort it out. I'm not sure whether it's just Chris's end or whether it's mine as well, but we'll just keep plugging away. But please do keep us up to date if the technology pulls out, because we want to make sure that everyone can obviously hear things. Now, as I mentioned, my name is Manuel Seidel. I've got a background in risk management. And I did my PhD helping organizations to develop their strategies around different areas of risk and obviously the management systems that underpin those strategies. Now, around 10 years ago, I co-founded ecoPortal, and today I'm one of the directors of the company. And ecoPortal is a software platform to help organizations with their health and safety, environmental and quality management systems, with the key idea being is that we're creating solutions that help organizations measure, manage and report on performance, but most importantly, engage people. And for us, integrating the systems into the business and moving beyond compliance is really key. So across Australia and New Zealand, we've got a broad range of clients. Most of them are household name New Zealand and Australian companies. And as I said, we're really passionate about helping organizations move beyond that box tick mentality. So both Chris and I are very excited about the changes to ISO 45001, and we're very excited about this webinar and looking forward to your interactions. So just to provide a little bit of a background, and I'm sure this is preaching to the converted. However, Last year at the World Congress on Health and Safety in Singapore in September, there was an updated stat that came through that 2.78 million people per year die of work-related deaths. And for me, this was quite a shocking number, and I'm sure one of the key reasons why many of us have joined the health and safety profession. At that same World Congress, we got a figure that 3.9% of the global GDP per year is spent on addressing health and safety concerns. So that's significant, $3 trillion a year. So for both those reasons, I believe that's why ISO decided that it's time for an international standard for health and safety management. So here we are now. So the journey to ISO 45001, well, as I said, it's been a long time coming, 5 years in the making. In March 2013, that's when the project was first approved. And since then, there have been a number of different drafts in the pipeline, starting with November 2013, where the first working draft appeared, and then moving on to committee drafts in March and July of 2018, followed by the first draft international standard, which was launched in November 2015. And the latest news, as you'll all be aware of now, 93% of national bodies voted in the final draft international standard to be published. That was in January, and we've now heard that on the 12th of March of 2018, in a couple of months' time, we'll finally have the publication of the ISO 45001 standard. So it's an exciting milestone for the health and safety community, and we're really looking forward to seeing what impact it might have. So the American Society for Safety Engineers, who were a key stakeholder in the development of the ISO 45001 standard, they see ISO 45001 as one of the most significant developments in workplace health and safety over the past 50 years. And they see this as an opportunity to move the needle on reducing occupational health and safety risks. So there are many people that are thinking of the new standard as a game changer in health and safety. And I'm personally quite excited about it. I think that this is a real opportunity for us to change the way in which we implement our health and safety systems and ensure that they move beyond that box-ticking mentality that I alluded to in the start of this presentation. I think it's really important that we look to engage people and integrate the systems into our business. And I see that in the ISO 45001 standard, many of those concepts have been integrated into the requirements. So some of the key facts here are that the ISO 45001 standard is a completely voluntary standard. It doesn't, in fact, increase or change any of the organization's legal requirements. What it does do is it provides a framework for organizations to develop an effective health and safety management system. And as part of that, you should be able to understand and assess what your legal requirements are and have processes in place to manage those legal requirements. So while it doesn't provide or it doesn't increase your organization's legal requirements, it does provide a platform for the organization to better manage those requirements. Now, the New Zealand committee was an observing member of the development of the ISO 45001 standard, whereas the Australian committee was a participatory member. But Standards New Zealand, as we understand it, is already working on the NZS ISO 45001 standard, which will pretty much be exactly the same as the ISO 45001 standard. The 45001 standard aligns really well with the New Zealand legal context. So we understand that that new standard will be very similar. And for those of you who are already certified to OHSAS 18001, the information here is that the standard will be withdrawn and certified organizations will have a 3-year period of transition to move to the 45001 standard. Now, early signs are that ASNZ 4801 will also be repealed, and there's likely going to be a transition period for moving to that as well.
Yeah. Can I just say here, Manuel, that 18,001 will be available and you will be able to be certified for a period of 3 years. Some people don't recognize that OHSAS 18001 is a BSI standard, and we're now talking about an ISO standard, two completely different standards makers.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Chris. Now we move on to the core of the presentation here, and this is an introduction to the key concepts of the ISO 45001 standard. Now, Important here to keep in mind that the new standard introduces a high-level structure, and that is the same high-level structure that the other management system standards have already been using. So, for example, ISO 14001 for environmental management and ISO 9001 for quality management both use this high-level structure already. In technical terms, they call it Annex SL, and essentially it is a series of 10 clauses that have the purpose of making these different management system standards align and make them look and feel the same, with the goal of making them easier to integrate. So essentially there are a range of 10 clauses, and they have some core text, and then there are some discipline specific text. So in this case, health and safety specific text. Now, those 10 clauses are all built around the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. And what we're going to do now is we're going to drill down into the different areas of those clauses and provide you with some insights into the key areas for you to take account of. So the first thing to note here is that the new standard takes a stronger focus on the organization's context. Now, with ISO 45001, organizations will have to look beyond their own health and safety issues and consider what society expects from them in regard to health and safety. So the context of the organization, or in other words, the business environment, refers to the combination of both internal and external factors and conditions that can affect its approach to health and safety management. This aids the integration of health and safety within the existing business environment, rather than it being looked upon as a separate function. And I'm sure many of us will be already familiar with the siloed health and safety systems that you often see that are kind of folders on the shelf that don't really integrate well with the business. And this is what ISO 45001 is looking to address with this. Now, internal and external issues can be both positive and negative and include characteristics or changing circumstances that can affect health and safety management system. So, for example, external issues can include the competitive landscape or the key trends relevant to the industry that have an impact on the organization. And internal issues can include your organizational culture, the structure of the organization, and the types of products and services that the organization creates, as well as any existing standards or guidelines that you might have adopted. Once the organization has understood the context, the next step here is to identify the key stakeholders or parties that have an interest in the organization's health and safety management system. And the stakeholders could include both internal people, such as your staff and your management and your board, as well as external parties like customers, contractors, suppliers, or the general public. Now, once we've understood who those stakeholders are, it's a good idea to then gauge what their needs and expectations are in the context of health and safety. And those requirements should then be assessed against the current and future legal requirements. So taking into account that context and the stakeholder issues, we then need to decide upon what the scope of the health and safety management system is. So the scope is essentially the sphere of activities and products and services that are within the organization's responsibility and control and that are covered by the management system. And you can see that the scope is now on your screen. So you can see that there are a number of inputs and outputs moving into that scope, and then there's an intended outcomes of the health and safety management system.
Can I just say, Manuel, that in terms of the scope, particularly when you're thinking of multi-site organizations, you know, they may have a headquarters in Auckland and then somewhere down country have another facility. You can exclude the down the country facility if you so wish, as long as you're not just excluding it because of the risks or the high risks that facility carries. So that's very useful for multi-site organizations to determine how much is going to be in the management system. And when you mention context, I used to think in terms of this is like your risk profile for the organization, but not just a health and safety risk, a risk to reputation, as well as health and safety risks. So it's a true risk profile.
Absolutely.
Okay, Manuel.
So we're now going to drill into the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, and at the center of everything, leadership and worker participation are very central. So ISO 45001 recognizes that without these key elements, health and safety systems can be very compliance focused. So for those of you joining this webinar from New Zealand and Australia, which I think most people are, these concepts aren't really new, as they're two key central elements of the Health and Safety at Work Act here in New Zealand and also the legislation across most of the states of Australia. So as part of the new standard, top management is now required to demonstrate a greater direct involvement in the organization's health and safety management system. And this is through direct participation and taking health and safety performance into account in terms of strategic planning. Now, ISO 45001 makes health and safety an organization-wide concern. It changes several requirements for management participation and engagement into a more general leadership provision. And this is a subtle distinction designed to empower all staff to make health and safety a priority. Now, there's an absence of the need for a specific management representative, and that was in the 18001 and 4801 standards. And this is now removed from ISO 45001 as an attempt to ensure that the ownership of the organization's health and safety management system is not simply focused around one individual like a health and safety manager. And some of the key and interesting points to note here are that top management is responsible for ensuring that the health and safety management system is compatible with the overall business strategy and that the system is integrated into the day-to-day business processes. Top management is also responsible for supporting other relevant management roles to demonstrate their leadership as it applies to their areas of responsibility. And in addition to that, a new concept is that top management is responsible for protecting workers from reprisals when reporting health and safety incidents and hazards and risks. In addition to that, as part of the commitment of the organization to health and safety management, top management is responsible for the development and dissemination of the organization's health and safety policy. The policy needs to include a commitment to safe and healthy working conditions by preventing both injury and ill health, not just accidents. In terms of organization roles, responsibilities, and authorities, top management of the organization needs to ensure that the responsibilities and authorities for relevant levels of the organization are assigned and communicated. So while responsibility and authority can be assigned, ultimately top management is still accountable for the functioning of the health and safety management system. And top management needs to assign responsibility for maintaining the health and safety management system and making sure that it's in alignment with the ISO 45001 standard, as well as for communicating that the performance of the system to top management.
Yeah. What I wanted to add about top management, Manuel, is that it's a defined term, and it's the people who are controlling the organization at the very top. Now, a lot of the standard will require documented information for the processes and for the activity, but there's no documented information required for top management. So it strikes me is, if that's not going to be documented, how are top management going to be able to display that they've supported and developed these organization roles, that they've supported a proactive culture, and that they are committed and involved? Whilst that's an issue for top management to demonstrate it's even a greater issue for an auditor to make that assessment. And you can see a whole completely new dynamic going on if the organisation is going for certification. The auditor has actually got to see the top person, and quite often in the past it would have been some delegated responsibility. So an issue on both sides there. Thank you, Manuel.
It's a really good point. And I think the standard here is quite explicit in its requirements around worker participation and consultation. It alludes to the removal of barriers to engagement, such as the failure to respond to ideas and suggestions, as well as eliminating language and literacy barriers. And I think this is quite relevant for many of the organizations and industries where there may be staff with English as a second language, or where a lot of the staff members maybe haven't yet finished school. The standard is explicit in making sure that there are no barriers to engagement, and actually that everyone across the organization needs to engage with every single aspect of the health and safety management system.
Sure. Heidi has asked the question, look, that's a $64 million question. How does the auditor assess top management when they've actually been contracted by top management? And that's right, Heidi. There will be those, the A-listers, as I call them, who are really committed and do things with great sincerity, the good leaders. And then there will be the B and C listers who are just after the badge and playing lip service to it all. So auditors are going to have a tough job, new skills, and they've got to have to What I would say is be very brassy about it and be authoritative as they can, as much as they can with top management. But you can see that they're going to be shouted down and nudged into a corner. Nice one, Heidi. Thank you.
I'm personally really excited about these changes. I think this emphasis on leadership and worker participation will ensure that we're really moving beyond those silos that we traditionally see with health and safety management system, where, as you say, they're very compliance focused, and people are obviously often focused on achieving the certification and cutting corners and developing kind of the folder on the shelf. And I think with these changes, ISO 45001 is really putting that emphasis on worker engagement and leadership. And I really hope that this will support in breaking those silos that we've traditionally seen. So it's very promising, and I'm glad the standard addresses those issues. Okay, we're just going to zoom in next into the planning area, and the planning area covers two focus areas: actions to address risks and opportunities, as well as occupational health and safety objectives. And I think by now we're probably all familiar with the concept of risk and the need to assess risk relating to the identified hazards that that have the potential to cause harm. Now, as part of the standard, the methodology for assessing the risks needs to be documented, and it needs to take into account the legal requirements and be proactive rather than reactive, as well as being systematic. Now, a vital part of the planning and implementation of a health and safety management system is the requirement to identify the risks and opportunities that can potentially impact its operation and the performance of the system. So therefore, in addition to the risks associated with health and safety hazards, the ISO 45001 standard introduces the need to identify and assess risks relating to the establishment and the maintenance of the health and safety management system itself. So there are 2 points here. You've got the risk assessment of the hazards, the operational hazards, and then you've got an understanding and the risks and opportunities associated with itself. So what are the risks that the management system isn't going to operate effectively, and what are the opportunities for improvement? That's a new concept in the ISO 45001 standard. Now, in relation to occupational health and safety objectives, when setting health and safety objectives, the ISO 45001 standard requires organizations to consider the available resources and to identify the responsible staff and the timelines and associated metrics for the gauging of success. So these changes may actually require some additional documentation in comparison to OHSAS 18001, and that's around formalizing the goals and priorities to a greater extent.
Okay, Manuel, a couple of points. It was interesting that the term human factors has crept into the standard, and I think most people experienced health and safety professionals will understand the issues about behaviour and human factors, but that is now included as a point in identifying the risks and opportunities, in particular in hazard identification. And then who's just gone off, Jeff is up there. He's got KPIs in all contracts for employees, including top management. Well, Jeff, I don't know whether you read the standard, but yeah, the objectives have got to be capable of evaluation. So that, in actual fact, does mean KPIs or something along those lines. And so perhaps that's one of the answers to the question we posed earlier about how top management is going to be assessed. Yes, get them some KPIs. That will be quite revealing. Okay, thank you, Manuel.
So moving on to the doing aspect of the PDCA cycle, that includes both the support and operations clauses of the high-level structure. Now, a key aspect of this is that resources need to be provided to support the management system. And that includes both providing competent people, the appropriately maintained infrastructure, and technology resources. Additionally, the knowledge necessary for the effective management system of health and safety needs to be determined and made available. Now, the terms documented procedure and records management, which were in the OHSAS 18001 and the 4801 standards, have now been removed and replaced with the term documented information in ISO 45001. And in this case, the organization needs to determine what documentation is necessary and the most appropriate medium for this documentation. And it's up to each individual organisation to determine the level and type of documentation that is necessary to control the health and safety management system. And whether this be paper folders or Excel spreadsheets and Word docs or a modern health and safety software system. And the appendix of ISO 45001 makes specific mention to keep the complexity of the documented information to a minimum level possible to ensure the effectiveness and simplicity of the system itself. And again, I think this moves back to the point around staff members who aren't necessarily management system experts, who may have English as a second language and may not have finished school. They don't need a complicated system. It's important that the system is user-friendly and intuitive, and that it makes it simple for people to interact with and ensure that they can engage with the system itself. Now, regarding awareness, there's an explicit focus in the standard around contractors and temporary workers, and they need to be made aware of health and safety risks that they're exposed to. And that's closely aligned with the communication aspect. And in communication, ISO 45001 mandates that communication objectives be defined and measured for their effectiveness. The standard is a lot more prescriptive in respect to the mechanics of communication, and that includes both the determination of what, when, and how to communicate. So importantly, communication processes need to facilitate two-way communication flows to ensure that there's an ability for workers to contribute to the continual improvement of the health and safety management system. Now, as part of operational planning, a key point of note is that organisations aligning with the standard, they're required to address health and safety requirements in their procurement processes. And this is by ensuring that the products and services that they're purchasing are aligned with their health and safety system. And then similarly, outsourced processes need to be controlled in line with the system itself. In regards to contractors, organisations need to ensure that processes are in place for ensuring that the contractors can identify and control their risks. And additionally, the standard does require that organisations define and apply health and safety criteria in the selection of their contractors.
Before we move off that slide, Manuel, there's a couple of points I wanted to make there, particularly in terms of this documented information. This is the standards makers' attempt to reduce the amount of paperwork and those guides that stay on the safety advisor's shelf and don't get out and about. So documented information can be gathered by any media. So it's not just a document. You can have audio, you have visual. So if you've got a camera or a camera phone, you can collect information in that way, and that would act as documented information. And I've been giving this area some thought, and that is, if this is this sort of media gathering tools are deployed effectively, such that all the workers at the coalface have their multi-media gathering phone, it's much more of a participative arrangement for health and safety than the traditional one where that was just in the territory of the safety advisor or a manager. So everybody can get involved with health and safety if you use these handheld devices in an imaginative way. Everybody can be a safety advisor, and everybody can gather the information to the central database. So I think that's a really good move. And I don't know whether when the standards makers thought of this, that it's going to be so far-sighted. The other...
I absolutely agree with you there, Chris. I mean, we've seen over the years, and I'm sure we all have the folders on the shelf that gather dust throughout the year, and no one ever reads until the auditor comes around, a couple of weeks before the time of the audit. And those are mediums that nowadays don't really engage end users. And if you've got a big folder with 100 policies and procedures, you've got to target the right audience. And nowadays, people in their private lives are, accessing rich media content via YouTube and other social mediums, images and audio and photographs. But then when they come to work, they're expected to read big, long documents. And, as we said, a lot of people may not, have literacy as their forte. And it's important to make sure that visual content is out there, because that's what people engage with these days. So I think you're right. It's a master stroke to have that in there.
It's good. Yeah, and I think it's probably one of the few demonstrable elements of this standard that supports the standards makers' attempt to make this much more flexible, to be user-friendly and more accessible to smaller companies. The other point I was going to mention, we've got a hierarchy of control, which has now been put into the standard, and I think people will be familiar with that, so that's useful. And you mentioned outsourcing, and this was quite a bit of confusion as to what outsourcing meant. Even I was struggling on that one. But yeah, this is where you have a production and a process and a service, and use second parties to deliver that service. So, for instance, if you've got a repair garage, and then you offer somebody a breakdown service and you contract that out to another party, that would be outsourcing. And that outsourcer has got to maintain and work to the same sort of standards that the parent organisation has got. And some of this in some countries is illegal, apparently. Particularly in France, you can't outsource your core service. So the French had a lot of trouble with this standard, and that was the reason why. Okay, Manuel.
It's a very interesting point there, Chris. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
So now we're going to drill into the checking element of the PDCA cycle here, and that includes the performance evaluation. Now, ISO 45001 strengthens and expands on many of the outgoing standards requirements for evaluation. Performance and monitoring results must now be documented information. And as part of the new emphasis on organizational context, these benchmarks should consider additional factors such as the legal requirements that we've talked about and the risks and opportunities as well as the objectives. Now, ISO 45001 also includes more detailed requirements for regulatory compliance and internal and external auditing. These changes are designed to actively engage workers across the organization, and relevant workers are in fact required to know the organization's current compliance status, and management must inform workers and relevant interested parties about the audit result. The new standard also expands the scope of the management review to include the risks and opportunities that we've discussed among some of the other factors. Was there anything further that you wanted to add around performance evaluation, Chris?
Oh, yeah. Yes, Manuel. What I was going to say, that first of all, that for those who have read the iterations of the standard, the final draft standard has removed the need for auditors, internal auditors in particular, to be, or auditors in general, to be competent. It was a strange thing to do, but certainly it goes without saying that if you're going to employ an auditor, you'd want them to be skilled and knowledgeable and so on. But competence was removed for whatever reason, not quite sure why that was. And just a word about what's going to happen to auditing in the future, that when the standard's published on the 12th of March, at or around the same time, there will be another ISO standard published, and it's ISO 17021/10, which is specification requirements for the competence of auditors. Now, it may not be actually come out on the same day, but it'll be out very, 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 very soon. So that will give some indication. And this is for auditors who are going to be working for certification bodies. It will give a specification for their competence requirements. And also in the offing is ISO 19,000 and there it is, 19,011, which is guidance for auditing management systems. And that's due for revision. It's 5-year revision. And there may be some changes in that. And there are one or two other moves in ISO to deepen the skills, knowledge, and offering of ISO on occupational health and safety management systems. There's a proposal to form a technical committee to give some legs to the when this particular standard comes in, because if you didn't have that, the standards makers for 45,001 would be dispersed, and there wouldn't be any continuity. So the continuity now is on a proposed technical committee. So there's some insights as to what will be happening in the future, and of course there is a great demand for auditor training, and I'll have a plug for what we will be offering. We'll be offering online auditor training, and it will be certified by an accreditation body. So we, I think, with this issue about auditing top management, the auditors will be playing a much more significant role in the future than perhaps they have in the past, and adding perhaps more value to your certification process.
Thank you,
Having
Chris.
said that, Manuel, I don't know whether we you'll be touching on later about the various levels of verification to the standard.
Indeed.
Is the first one.
Yes, we will.
Yeah, okay.
Wonderful. So the improvement aspect of the PDCA cycle here, obviously continual improvement is one of the core tenets of any ISO system. ISO 45001 further refines this. And in it, occupational health and safety management systems must identify and respond to non-conformity with action. The new standard completely abandons the idea of preventative action as a distinct concept, and instead the prevention becomes a fundamental requirement of the system in its entirety. So, for example, following an incident, compliant organizations must complete a root cause analysis and make the appropriate changes to ensure that similar incidents don't recur. The system is no longer merely reactive, and instead, incidents or non-conformity help drive the continual improvement cycle. So that's a change there. Okay, were there any further aspects that you wanted to add at this stage, Chris?
No, I think in terms of the slides, that seems fine.
Right.
I know there was a mention by Ryan about conformity assessment body, not a certification body. That's fine. Sorry about the slip of the tongue, Ryan. What I was going to ask, though, because and I don't know how New Zealand operates, as to whether there is in actual fact an accreditation body in New Zealand that's been, shall we say, supported by government, or is it a very dispersed arrangement? No,
there is one, and that's JASANS, and that organisation operates across Australia and New Zealand, and JASANS provides that accreditation for certification bodies. Okay, so now we're going to summarise the key concepts introduced in ISO 45001. So as I mentioned at the start, there is a high-level structure, and that high-level structure has been designed to ensure that there's an alignment between the other management system standards like ISO 9001 and 14001, as well as ISO 27001. Obviously, this is an opportunity to ensure that all of the standards can be easily integrated, and that there's an ease of understanding across those different management system standards. Now, there's a key focus on setting the context of the organization and ensuring that that context is taken into account in the development of the management system itself, which is a key important point, making sure that you're understanding your stakeholder requirements and building those requirements into the development of the scope and the management system itself. Now, in terms of top management responsibility, as we mentioned, there's a focus on leadership and moving beyond compliance. Top management is accountable for the health and safety management system, although some responsibilities can be assigned. At the end of the day, the buck stops with them. And obviously, worker engagement, and this is my favorite one, is a key aspect. Workers need to be engaged in every aspect of the management system itself. Whereas in some of the previous standards, there were areas that were the exclusive domain of management. There's now the need to engage workers in everything from the development of your policy to the assessment of the risks to the development of controls. So everything across the board, which I think is fantastic. Now, in terms of communication, there's a need for two-way communication, ensuring that there are no barriers for stakeholders within and external to the organisation to engage with the health and safety management system. We talked about risk management. Obviously, there's the need to assess your hazards, your operational hazards, but also the importance of understanding the risks and opportunities relating to the management system itself. So what are the risks that the management system is not performing as effectively as it could be, and what are the opportunities for improvement? And as we talked about, outsourced operations need to use the parent company's health and safety management system standards. All right, so here's the big question. Does it make sense to adopt ISO 45001? And I think this is, and Chris, you'll probably agree with me that this is going to be dependent on the context of the organisation. So whether you're a small business that's operating locally, or whether you're a large multinational company that has international clients, that's going to be a key aspect of it. Obviously, cost comes into consideration, but you alluded to earlier, Chris, that there are a number of different ways that you can verify yourself against the ISO 45001 standard. You don't just get the opportunity for third-party certification, but there's self-verification and second-party auditing. Chris, do you want to explain the differences between those three types of verification?
Sure. With self-verification, that does what it says on the can, in actual fact, is that if you do work to the system and your internal audits confirm that you've got to the stage generally that you're checking and acting, we know the PDCA cycle. If you've got to the stage of checking and are acting, normally certification would be offered to you. But we're not talking about certification, so self-verification. So if your auditor feels that you've got to the checking and acting level, the organisation, presumably top management, can self-verify. So that can be that could work well for an organisation. I was speaking to a large public body today who said certification for them would put, probably 6 figures. But I said, well, why do you need to certify? Well, we don't. So the self-verification is for that. The second party audit is by some external organisation who audits to the standard. And that second party auditor is generally someone in the supply chain. So it may be a client, or it may be a customer, somebody in the supply chain. So a large food distribution company may well audit the prime producer on the farm. So that would be a second party audit. What is also allowable is desktop online auditing for second party audits as well. That has been written into the ISO standards I mentioned earlier. And then we've got the third-party audit for certification. And as you mentioned in the earlier bullet point, Manuel, does it make sense to adopt 45001? And I think there will be those organisations who want to drive their business forward for all the best reasons and will adopt it. However, what's going to happen to their supply chain? Now, their supply chain can make or break that organisation by having a poor operating standard. So if the main organisation is going for 45001, that will have an effect on the supply chain. And this is where you will be finding that there will be those who are going to have to go kicking and screaming to adopt 45001 or lose business.
Mm-hmm. I think you make some really good points there, Chris. And for me, and I'm sure many of us have seen this over the years, that a lot of organizations are prone to falling into what I call the compliance trap. So when they look at a management system standard like ISO 45001, often they think of it as there's a need for certification. And when you focus on that certification, you end up developing a Frankenstein system that ticks the boxes of the ISO standard and can be used to achieve certification via a third-party audit, but often the system itself is not effective in helping the organization reduce the risk and improve the business performance. So for me, I always like to say that it's important to focus on the system. It's important to focus on engagement. And I can see in the chat, there's a lot of conversations around engagement. For me, that's the most critical thing, making sure that the system is embedded in the organization, people are engaging with it and interacting with it, making sure it's not a siloed system. And then when that system is in place, and when you've got that engagement and it's helping you to measure, manage, and report your performance, you're going to have a system that helps you to reduce your business risks and ultimately keep people safe. And then as a bonus, you're going to achieve certification anyway. But if you develop your system for the purposes of certification, there's often a cutting of corners, which will mean that the system achieves the certification, but it doesn't give you the business benefits that the standard was actually developed to allow you to achieve. So for me, that's a really critical point. Develop the system in alignment with ISO 45001, but don't develop it for the purposes of certification. That can be an optional extra should you want to go down that path. Okay, so we've talked about focusing on the system and obviously the need for engagement. For me, it's also really important to ensure that resources are made available. This, I think, is an opportunity for organizations to move beyond the systems that they've got in place already and really steer things in the right direction if they're not already, if they don't already have an effective health and safety management system. So 45001 can create a new, I suppose, vision or a new milestone to work towards, and making sure that the right resources are in place to work towards alignment with 45001 is critical. Now, I think the integration with the existing risk management systems is really was really fantastic, and it's great that there is that high-level structure that will allow organizations to better align their management systems. Obviously, there will be stakeholders in your organization that may have already been involved with ISO 9001 or ISO 14001. And it's good for health and safety professionals who are looking to implement ISO 45001 to interact with those stakeholders. For me, I always think it's a good idea to integrate different risk management systems together wherever possible, rather than having siloed health and safety, environmental and quality systems that are individual to each other. And for me, the reason for that is there are a lot of people in the organization, the end users, who aren't necessarily management systems experts or health and safety experts. And when an incident occurs, if they can go to that one integrated platform, whether it's a quality event or a health and safety or an environmental event, if they go to that one system and log that incident or that risk, they don't have to worry about what discipline it is. So obviously this isn't always possible in all organizations, but wherever it is, I always like to recommend try and integrate your systems. And I think the new ISO 45001 standard provides the opportunity to do that. And finally, sorry, go for it, Chris.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think if there was more room on the slide, we could put another bullet point in there. And where do you start? Well, you've got to start at the top, Manuel, haven't we? I think we all are recognizing that, and the standard gives you a pretty good lever up to the top of the tree. But you've got to have top management buy-in, haven't we, to take this forward. Otherwise, it's just going to be lip service again. So how are you going to persuade top management to take this up? I mean, there's arguments, isn't there, on cost, savings, the moral one about the workforce and so on. I'd like to think there's a question there on the lips of the safety advisor saying to the person at the top, well, okay, so you're not going to go for this standard. Would you want your son and daughter to work in a place that's managed in the way that you're going to manage it? And sort of make it personal if you have to, but you've got to use some soft skills on the more difficult top management. And not an easy pitch.
No, I think you're right. And sometimes I think the certification problem can be a barrier here. Often when top management see that the organization has been certified against the management system standard, like 18,001 or 4 out of 1, or in the coming up for 45,001, once you've achieved a certain level of certification, management can become complacent and believe that, you've got the stamp from a third party. And sometimes, it's important to just cry out to the auditor and say, look, we really want you to give us your honest opinion on how our system is operating, because if we get the certification and the system isn't up to scratch, management still is going to believe that certification. And so sometimes I think that certification process can be an enemy in really getting that buy-in from top management.
Sure. Yes, that's right. And thinking about buying in, if you've got a really difficult person at the very top, you've got to look for friends, haven't you? You've got to look for champions who will fight your cause, and get people, the influencers and the thought leaders within the organization to go along with you. And then that could put pressure on the very top. Okay, Manuel?
One way that we recommend you can get started is by conducting an ISO 45001 gap analysis. And we've created a self-assessment on ecoPortal that everyone will be given access to after this webinar. And essentially, it's a free tool that you can use, log into, and in this self-assessment, you're able to look at what of ISO 45001 are and assess your organization's performance against those different requirements. So, for example, all of the questions around the context, leadership, and the different clauses of ISO 45001 are created in here. And you can then add your company to the system. It's completely confidential, and you have your own platform in there. Now, you're able to answer those different questions here. And every time you answer a question, you're able to put commentary around where your organization sits, where perhaps with some evidence around what how you're complying with those different requirements. And on the basis of your responses to those questions, it'll give you a gauge on how well you are performing in the different areas of the management system itself. Now, at the end of the assessment, there is the opportunity to get an overall picture of how well the organization is performing against all aspects of ISO 45001. So, as I said, this is a free self-assessment tool, and it's a good starting point for organizations to understand how well they're aligned with 45001. Now, in addition to this self-assessment that everyone will be getting access to, we've provided access to some of our other modules here, the incident, risk, and actions modules. These have all been designed to align with ISO 45001, and they may just give you some inspiration or ideas on how you may like to implement your system going forward. So we'll be providing you with that ISO 45001 self-assessment as a follow-up to this webinar. And now we have got some times for questions here, and I think there's been a lot of self-questioning and answering going on in the chat, which is fantastic. But maybe we'll start with Ryan's question here. Ryan asks, how would an assessor go about determining an organization's level of senior management commitment? Did you want to answer that one, Chris?
Well, that's a tough one. That is the biggest question. This has been the whole theme of this presentation, is how you get top management engagement. Well, written into the standard is that top management has got to support a positive health and safety culture. So perhaps most people and safety professionals will be experienced in measuring culture. It's not an easy thing to do, but there are tools to do it, and you need to go and do a bit of managing by walking about. So as a starting point, that could work. And we've seen some of the answers and questions that the audience has put in there, KPIs. Well, I think that a lot of far-sighted and modern progressive organizations will have measures of health and safety performance in the reviews of their managers, etc. But who monitors the person at the top? Well, it's got to be, whatever the expression is in New Zealand, the board or the stakeholders. That's the shareholders if it's a public company. But if it's a private company, difficult job. But I think this is where, as an observer or an auditor, you go and speak to the workforce and see what their attitude and how they view their management, if you can get them in a corner by themselves and talk about it. So just a few pointers there.
Yep. We've got another question here from Karen. How long will the self-assessment be available? Now, we're going to make that self-assessment available indefinitely. So you can log in and you can do that self-assessment. You can conduct a self-assessment multiple times over a period of whatever period you want. So it's available for everyone that's involved in this webinar, completely free of charge into the future. Now, we've got another question here around Safe Plus and how Safe Plus will align with ISO 45001. Obviously, Safe Plus is a New Zealand specific standard, and yes, there will be some overlaps there. Now, I have heard in my conversations with Standards New Zealand that ISO 45001, the NZS version, is in development, and as I mentioned at the start, it's most likely that NZS version of ISO 45001 will be very much the same, but there may be some contextual changes in there that are relevant to New Zealand, and they will, I'm sure, take into account Safe Plus and other aspects. Okay, so we're quickly.
So could I just ask Manuel, with the OHSAS New Zealand 45001, is there any guidance that's going to be produced to support the standard? Because ISO haven't produced any guidance. I know BSI, because I'm on the committee and drafting the guidance ourselves, will produce some sort of supportive guidance. I would say it's crying out for an interpretation, you know, what we've done in this last hour to try and make it accessible. Do you know?
I don't know for sure, and as I understand it, the committee is coming together and working through those things. And over the period of the next weeks and months, I'm sure we'll figure out the details around that. What I do know is other NZS ISO standards like 9001 and 14001, they're very much a copy and paste of the international standard. So I'm guessing that there won't be too many differences there. Okay, so we're quickly running out of time here, but of course we will be answering those questions that we haven't managed to get through. We'll be sending those responses as part of the follow-up pack, which you'll all be receiving over the coming days. Well, I really appreciated all the engagement and interaction that we've had over the chat and over the question and answers. Obviously, really appreciate, Chris, your time and your attendance. We know it's almost 1 a.m. in the morning for you now, so I know our listeners, I'm sure, have very much appreciated your insights and your expert feedback here. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. Thank you, everyone else, for your attendance, and we will be sending the follow-up pack, as I said, and we'll have someone be in touch to talk further about those things. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day.